Good evening, everyone. Hope you're doing great, whether you're here with us in person or attending virtually on Webex. The Student Architecture Committee and the Architecture School of Alba would like to welcome you all to the 7th edition of this year's series of webinars involving architects, designers, and theoreticians, to name a few. My colleague and I are proud to present one of the most prominent figures of experimental architecture and visual representation. Perry KULPER is an architect that can present a long and varied drawing practice, which ranges from early orthographic drawings, such as House in Borrego Springs, among many others, to mixed media techniques involving collage and, in most recent years, digital modeling and rendering. His practice is, as he describes, relying on an understanding of design as a kind of relational thinking, framing objects, events, or conceptual frameworks as structured relationships within the world, and drawing seems to become the site within which he commonly explores this. Each of Perry KULPER's architectural drawing is a cosmos of information and possibilities that resist the banal and simplest reductionism too typical of contemporary architectural representation. Series after series, his drawing displays objects as background and background as object in a constant visual journey of an architecture that doesn't settle and always evolves, an architecture of ideas.
Perry KULPER is an architect and an associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan Stoneman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. He previously taught for 17 years at SciArc in Los Angeles and held visiting teaching positions at the University of Pennsylvania and Arizona State University. Subsequent to his graduate studies at Columbia University, he worked for Eisenman Robertson, Robert A.M. Stern, and Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown Architects before moving to Los Angeles. His interests include the generative potential of architectural drawing, the different spatial opportunities of diverse design methods, and broadening the conceptual range by which architecture contributes to our cultural imagination. In 2013, he published Pamphlet Architecture 34, Fathoming the Unfathomable, Archival Ghosts and Paradoxical Shadows with Nat Short. Recently, he ventured into the world of digital, attempting to get a handle on cut-paste and magic wand operations in Photoshop. As a result, he has encountered one of his steeper learning curves. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Perry KULPER will talk and develop his architectural works and design philosophy through this lecture entitled Constructing Evidentiary Fields. Perry KULPER, it is an honor to have you with us at Alba. It was a great privilege for us to present such a prominent architect. A recorded version of this lecture will soon be available on YouTube. And for those online, please don't hesitate to drop your questions in the chat box. We wish everyone a good listening. Perry KULPER, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And I'm sorry, I'm totally forgetting who introduced me first. Your name?
Elias.
Elias. I knew it started with an E. So thank you, Joseph, Elias, and Chris, for the invitation and in the introduction here. It's super gracious of all of you, and it's really nice to see all of you. I wish I was in the auditorium with you, listening to you present your stuff. So I'm going to share a screen. While I do that, the talk. Let me get this out of the way. Click on that. Just make sure you can. Are you good to go there?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the talk is called, as was mentioned, Constructing Evidentiary Fields. And I've been interested in, when I grew up in architecture school, like all of you, maybe who are students there, everything that we did was essentially synthetic. It was complete, total. We knew everything sort of at the same level or levels. Increasingly, I'm interested in how we might work and maybe even spatialize certain pieces of evidence that are not necessarily synthetic or complete, but that might produce kind of metaphorical crimes as a result of people taking ownership of those kinds of evidence. So some of the drawings that I'll show in particular are they weren't conceived that way when I made them. Many of the drawings I'll show you were made in the middle and late 90s and early 2000s. And I've more recently begun to think about detectives and evidence fields and partial critical fragments of things as ways to enable not a totalizing picture, but where people can make their own stories relative to some of the work. So this is the work table behind me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to talk about visualizations or representation or drawings as a way to leverage a number of key concerns that I have that are broader, certainly, than those techniques. Anyway, when I get set up to work, I generally, there's a discipline to the construction of the field in which I work. So there are often books open, there are JPEGs on my iMac where I'm talking to you from. I clean all of my gear, blah, 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 blah. So I sort of, it comes from my days in cycling when I raced on the road, where the preparation was as important as riding the race itself. So that's part of the discussion. Let's see if I can, for some reason, it's not letting me advance. You know what I'm going to do? Let me, I'm going to stop sharing that. I'm going to try to go back to it and reload it. It wasn't letting me advance the images. Let's try that again. It did before. Slideshow. Let's try this. Yep. So I made 3 title pages because I couldn't decide which one, and I'll touch on these projects as I work through them, but this is the second one. And this is actually a collaboration with my good friend Mark West, which I'll talk about this work briefly in a bit. Recently, I've been, a lot of people have suggested that I try to put together a book of some kind of my work and teaching. And I should say that probably 85% of what I understand about architecture, particularly in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, let's say, comes through teaching. So I have a great regard for education and the opportunities that it affords, both for me, but also in my interactions with students and colleagues and people I don't know at all. Anyway, as a result of thinking about a possible book, I've started to make a kind of list, a set of organs, basically, a kind of body of things that I would, that I care about, have thought about, have worked through, that might help me organize some of the content of the book. And that those things move from the grounding in the history of ideas. In other words, I believe architecture or spatiality always participates in the history of ideas, whether we know it or not. So it's important, that participatory sense is important. And then thinking, I'll just randomly pick a few things: epistemological models, that is forms of knowledge construction, then understanding practical, discursive, and rhetorical thinking, sort of pedagogical models, design methods, how schools are structured, relationships to distant and allied disciplines, unpacking things we take for granted, and so on. So this is a kind of, it's just an outline, really, of things that I want to try to think about caring for, both through my work and through work that I'll likely include student work. I wanted also, I've been influenced by a lot of things, a lot of people, a lot of things, a lot of conceptual frameworks. And I've identified 5 that I think are maybe particularly important. One is the curiosity cabinet. That is, curiosity cabinets or Wunderkammers, really, they were developed essentially to develop a sense of worldliness for people in control or in power positions. So that things like explorers would go into the world and they would bring things from distant places and they would assemble them in a Wunderkammer. So I'm interested in heterogeneous ideas, that is, multiple kinds of ideas, not always the same family of ideas or relationships in a piece of work. So the curiosity cabinet is a helpful analog for me, a kind of metaphorical ally. The Baroque period, both philosophically, but also in terms of developments of the self and in terms of developments in mathematics, and plasticity in architecture and allegorical structuring and theatrical developments and so on, painting. There are a lot of things about the Baroque period that are really, really important to me. If I could displace myself, I would love to be a Baroque architect. I wouldn't mind being a surrealist also. And this is why the Duchamp piece called Fountain of 1917, the urinal, which he basically acquired and signed R. Mutt and hung it upside down essentially in an exhibition and called it art. This piece is important to me, as is Duchamp and the Dadas and the Surrealists, for two key reasons. One, through this piece of work, Duchamp was really asking who could author art. In other words, if I could go and acquire a urinal and hang it in a space and call it art, I wouldn't need to be a trained artist, let's say. The second part of it, and that opens up for me all kinds of interesting questions about authorship and audience construction. The second part of the important aspect of this piece for me is that it really he asked what qualifies as art. Not only who can make it, but if a urinal qualifies as art, that opens the floodgates in terms of the history of the production of art culturally. This kind of thinking was not in play at all. So this is a radical, for me, a radicalization of both culture, but also in terms of my own thinking. It was mentioned that I worked with Denise Scott Brown and Bob Venturi for 5 years. And when I was a graduate student, the first book I read was Towards a New Architecture by Korb. And the second book I read was Complexity and Contradiction by Bob. And it's been deeply influential for me for a number of reasons, both because I worked extremely closely with Bob and Denise, but also I'm interested in his interest in ambiguity, the difficult whole, both and so on. So it's been an important, it's not a Bible, it's a grounding mechanism for me in terms of my early architectural education. And then one more example comes from the American artist Matthew Barney, who used to hang out with Bjork for quite a few years. You probably know Bjork, but you may or may not know Matthew Barney. Anyway, he made a series of projects that he called drawing restraints. And the reason it interests me is essentially Barney produced obstacles to himself so that he could not draw or paint as he had. And so I'm interested, therefore challenging his default assumptions about how he worked, opening other creative capacities, because he would strap himself to the hull of a ship, or he would be strapped up in a corner like he is here. And that allowed him to develop alternative ways to think about producing work, but also alternative practices physically. Yeah, I mentioned that I'm interested in lots of things and have been influenced dead people, live people, things, conceptual frameworks, and so on. So I make a lot of lists, mostly in my yellow pads, my 8.5 inch by 11 inch yellow pads. But I also keep track in slides like this of things that are of interest or have been some import to me. So for example, game boards, puzzles, and conundrums, surrealism, odd musical instruments, X-rays, Zen gardens, Borromini, Candida Hofer, and so on, Wim Wenders, the filmmaker. So I think it's important for me to be able to reflect on where my roots are, whether those are explicit or implicit roots. So I keep track of those kinds of things. When I lecture, I often show this slide, and it's an important one for me because this is, if the first image that I showed with the list was a kind of an overall set of positional observations, these are more operational. These are the things I deploy when I work often. So the yellowed ones are probably the biggest, the broadest things, and it was touched on. I'm interested in relational structuring. What do I mean by that? So if I had a wooden pencil, I don't know whether you probably can't see this. You can. It's a thing. It's a wooden pencil. It's a Ticonderoga #2, and I've gone through hundreds and hundreds of them. But importantly for me, it's a set of structured relationships. And what do I mean by that? For example, in some way or ways, this pencil belongs to the history of writing. It belongs to deforestation, mass production. The erasure suggests that it belongs to worlds to do with censorship, and so on. So while those things aren't explicit to us when we work with or on things or as we behave in the world, those things are things in the world, phenomena in the world are structured relationally. And I'm interested in overcoming the objecthood of things and really understanding the type of relationships, the weight or strength of relationships, and the temporal structure of relationships. That's what I mean when I'm talking about relational structuring. Because to me, all architects do, all we do normally through material disposition is we restructure relational assemblies. That's what our work is. Now, you can have all kinds of content, the audiences vary, and there are different ambitions and so on, but basically we restructure relational contours or relational assemblies that are temporally structured in the world. And for me, temporality is the largest organizational structure of the world as we know it. That is the disposition of things in time structures, and it's not linear or chronological time. Temporality is much more complex than that. Anyway, I'm interested also in the generative potential of drawings, design methods, which I'll touch on momentarily, enlarged conceptual breadth, and then the white ones below are things that are really, really particular to me. Things like tailored visualizations, meaning, and I'll touch on this a little bit, meaning that I try to tailor, or if I need to invent drawing or representation or writing or modeling techniques to work on certain questions or problems or issues, I will do that. I don't take for granted almost anything. I don't take as default the ways we work, the techniques, the histories of architecture, and so I don't take for granted those things. I try to tailor them. I try to invent, if need be, speciate things so that I can work properly and more effectively on things. Anyway, I care about a range of other kinds of things. The language of representation, for example, is different than the language of architecture. They have overlaps in context, but they're fundamentally different. So blah, blah, blah. Analogous thinking is a big deal for me. The use of language folds, I use that programmatically. I help frame work that way and so on. So these are key things that matter to me. Maybe one of the key things is called the mechanics of engagement. That essentially is the roles and capacities and potential of all of the variables in a piece of work and how they interact. The roles and capacities of the variables meaning ambitions, positioning the work, sites, if there are something like sites, techniques, content, all those things comprise the makeup, the body, the diagrammatic body of the work. And I'm interested in how those things interface with one another a lot. One of the most, in my opinion, one of the most undertaught things in architectural education, there are three key things. One is conceptual broadening. Two is transformation. That is to change the nature of the questions and the formations as work unfolds. That's different than development, which 99% of the work in the world follows developmental trajectory. So I'm interested in transformation, but I'm not going to talk about that now. And I'm also interested in how we work. That is design methods. And I think that's a critical missing component, to be honest, in architectural education. Everybody works methodologically, whether we know it or not. What's less clear is that we understand where methods come from, what their preferences and biases are, how authors interface with them. Do they lead directly to spatiality or to an object or a landscape? What are the case studies that comprise different kinds of methods? So these are 14 that I've identified. There are probably 114. I like to think about it this way. If you took these 14 design methods and said, I'm going to design a house project using one method at a time, and I'm going to design 14 houses, you could do radically different work. Same program, same kind of site, if there was a site, and so on. So I would beg people out there to think about how you work. So design methods are how you work. The techniques of representation are how one engages design methods. And the design methods can be many, they can be combinatory, it's not just you use one and you produce a piece of work. It's virtually never that for me or for the students that I work with. Again, more lists. I just keep track of visualization thoughts. Drawings as a way to rehearse design decisions, number 8. 10, avoidance of reduction, or what I call the crisis of reduction. That is reducing things too quickly, trying to maintain degrees of complexity when appropriate. Drawing non-figures to discover what the figures might be, whether apparitions, strong or weak figures, perhaps others. So I keep a lot of this kind of stuff in yellow pads generally, but I share it, in lectures and sometimes when I'm in other formats when I'm discussing things that I do or I work with with students. There are consistent patterns in my work. Analogic thinking is a key. Collections, taxonomies, and curiosity cabinets, titles and elongated captions, miniaturization and scalar fluctuations, split temporalities and split geographies. These aren't things, it's not a grocery list that I go to a project and say, I'm going to pick from this list. But these are things that turn up with some frequency across the body of my work. So this is, again, just getting ready for working. And this is, so that's the manual space that's 2.5 feet behind me, not quite a meter. This is the space that I'm looking at my iMac. So I know a few Photoshop operations, and I work with people who work digitally and work. And then this is increasingly a space of work, Instagram. I'm not sure why I just randomly post things, but it's an interesting space. I've just written 2 pieces for a new book that's linked to the influences of Instagram on design culture. And so this is an interesting workspace as well. I'm super interested in working at very different speeds. So I'll show you a piece of work at David's Island where the drawing took me 125 hours just to make the drawing. These little word ditties are momentary. So there are speeds of working that are a handful of seconds. And they're, for me, because I'll never get to them, they're entire projects. So digital mania. And they're organized, the yellow captions or titles are 7, what I think about as contemporary areas of disciplinary or architectural concern. I'll just give you a few examples. Digital mania, out of focus architecture, architecture of multiple psychologies, spatial ventriloquism, 3 houses in one, architecture that forgets its own presence, the energy of line types, when is the time of rendering. So these are all projects for me. They allow my imagination and my conceptual breadth to remain open. They prompt certain spatial and representational possibilities for me, and so on. I would recommend, if you're up for it, you don't have to do it in this format, but to figure out ways to work quickly. This is another way to work quickly. It's super, super, super important. I didn't understand this when I was in school at all, to vary the speeds by which we work, because you afford yourself different kinds of insights, intelligences, knowledge constructions, and so on, depending on those speeds and techniques and interests. So in 1992, I was teaching at SCIARC, amongst other things, in the first-year graduate program. And we would take students with us out to the Southwest in America, and we would stay a week. And we would do, not in hotels, we were camping and doing field measures and installations and so on. And I realized we were talking about landscape issues, of course, amongst other kinds of things. And I realized I basically knew nothing about the landscape, about landscapes. So I decided to make 1-a-day drawings, and I did for the first 6 weeks. I would get up, shower. I get up 4:35 in the morning. I would shower and I would eat and it would make a drawing. And these are some of the images of some of those drawings. I did that for 6 weeks, but at the time I was living in Los Angeles, where I was teaching at SCIARC. I was also part-time teaching at Penn, and my former wife, Amy, was doing a PhD at Cambridge. So I was in all three of those places. So I needed to be mobile, and these things were easy in that regard. Anyway, I made one a day for the 6 weeks, and then I made them very, very, very sporadically for the next while. Anyway, I've made 750 of them. I think the last one was made in 2004, but I have a pair of series that I hope to get back to. They're 18 inches wide, 12 inches high, and the image is basically 9 inches by 12 inches. And this is a series is between 4 is the smallest series, and 35 is the largest series. So I work on a series until I say, okay, I'm not getting anything out of these anymore. And they're super quick. They're between a half hour and an hour and a half is probably the longest one. Super great to do. Not landscapes. Again, one a day things. I recommend it highly. When I left Denise and Bob's office and moved to Los Angeles, the idea was I had taught at Penn and Yale a bit, and I had moved to Los Angeles because when you work closely with them, the only way really to leave the office is to move very far away. Otherwise, you're invested in that office. And I was happy to be there for 5 years and working enormous hours and so on. Anyway, I moved to Los Angeles, and I hoped to practice. And I had 3 commissions straight away. One was a small guest house near Santa Barbara, California. I was invited to a house competition in Germany, and I made 5 proposals in 5 weeks, and then I spent 10 days really working on this one. And then I had another real commission, which none of these got built, but I had a real commission for a small desert house in one of Southern California's deserts. Of course, it's a desert house, so it would be in a desert. Anyway, I made these projects, and they were more or less interesting to me at the time, but I realized as a result of making them that at this time I probably had, if I was healthy, another 50 years to participate in the discipline. And I realized that I didn't have broad enough interest. My techniques and skills were not wide enough. I had a really limited formal and material vocabulary. I really didn't understand a lot of disciplinary questions and so on, blah, 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 blah. So I said, you can't keep going like this. The projects were fine. So what I did then is with that last house, I then began to try to open the architectural drawing up a little bit. So this is a second version of that last house with the graphite drawings. And I call these aspectival drawings, and they're basically drawings. They're not plans or sections or elevations or anything. They're not conventional, but they're basically try to articulate the key aspects or the key fragments of this house proposal. So I began now to think about, well, there would be alternative ways for me to work on certain kinds of ideas or issues or content that didn't always force me in a way to go back to the conventions of plans, sections, axonometrics, perspectives, and so on. At that same time, Amy, as I mentioned, was doing a PhD in Cambridge, and we lived, this is the 4th house, and we lived in it was about a 3.5 meter wide house, and it was about 13 meters long. And anyway, I made a room essentially for that house. It has a leather floor. It has a double aquarium. It has a fire cactus wall. It has a rubber basement. It's got St. Paul's Cathedral in the double aquarium, blah, 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 blah. It's still similar in thinking, context, program, sort of client-based things and so on. So it's sort of conventional thinking. They were fine, those houses. They were okay. The key moment for me in my entire development came when a competition turned up, an open competition for an island called David's Island off of the East Coast, as it would be in the ocean, of New York. And I made what I called a strategic plot. And this is roughly 700 millimeters by 950 millimeters wide. And I use the drawing for I use it for three key reasons. One, all the drawings that I had done and the physical models that I had made were basically homogeneous in the language that they used. So, they were always plans were plans, sections were sections, perspectives were perspectives, basswood models were basswood models. So I wanted to, because I was ideating about a whole range of things to do with mythical folklore and military suppression and panoptic and panoramic vision, islandness, the history of islands, and so on. There were a bunch of ideas that I wanted to work on, but I couldn't figure out a way, basically, how to draw those things into a proposal. So I said, if you allow yourself to mix languages where words might hold certain set of ideas in play or a certain conceptual framework, there might be figurative pieces, there might be diagrammatic things that or notational things which talk about temporal development. If I could hold a lot in play in one drawing, so a form of visual thinking, that might allow me to care for more effectively the ideas that I had. So multiple languages of representation, objective number one. Objective number two was to try to deal with the content, some of the ideas or issues that I mentioned a minute ago, through programmatic invention. So I'm not going to talk about the relationship between ideas and issues and programmatic invention, but I'll just mention a few of the programs that were trying to deal with the content of the work. So, for example, there's a polished metamorphic rock garden. There are landings for mythical sea travelers. There's an axis of mutiny. There are labyrinths of emptiness, a multiplied officers' headquarters, easement fencing, no-fly zones, and so on. So the second point was that I used the drawing and my thinking to try to develop programmatic intentions that would allow me to touch the content, the issues, the substance of what I was trying to work on. And the third thing I wanted to deal with was the drawing as an object. The drawing is a thing in its own right. I'm not sure, am I still with you? The screen, yeah, I'm with you. So blah, 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 blah. Anyone who's interested, I'll be very, very quick, and I'll move through other work more quickly. The drawing is probably made of about 6 layers. There are animal x-rays, there are cut paper things, there are drawn parts, there are press type, letraset things, found imagery, and so on. The drawing, the technical part of the drawing, I researched islands for about 2.5 weeks before I started the project, before I started this drawing. And this is the first part of the drawing where I was trying to understand temporal constructions relative to indexical things, figurative things, and notational things. So that's the first part of the drawing. Anyway, the drawing took about, in total, is about a 125-hour drawing. And it's if I had to keep one drawing, that would be the one. It's super, super important for a number of reasons, including my father died during the competition, so I didn't submit the work, but it's important for me at a number of levels, including remembering my father in particular ways. This is a technical drawing of the, let's say, the architectural component. So there's a landing vessel. This is the polished metamorphic rock garden. These are the labyrinths, these are the mythical landings for sea travelers, and they have polyp labs that harvest kelp and do scientific research, labyrinths of emptiness, the axis of mutiny, and so on. I continued to try to crack open the architectural drawing in a competition 5 years later that I also did not enter, for a museum in Central California. And I began to be really quite specific about what the intentions were for each drawing. So often I give the drawings a program. I don't assume I'm going to make a plan, a section, a composite, a hybrid. I don't assume that. I say, what am I trying to work on, and what are the most effective ways to work on? So here I was trying to visualize the key ideas in the project. The roles of curation relative to museums, the etymology of the Greek muses as a foundational root for museums, scientific, historic, and aesthetic understandings about objects, vision and optics, and so on, kinds of things, and the site, the issues of the site, agricultural practices, immigrant workers, blah, 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 blah. So this is trying to visualize the key themes, the key issues, the key ideas. It's not a proposal. It's not, there's no architecture in it. There's a sequence of drawings that I call bridging techniques or bridging drawings, where I try to move from one drawing or one set of ideas or set of understandings to the next phase of the work. And these are called cryptic drawings. They're the same as sort of 700 meters by 950 millimeters by 950 millimeters. And they're basically chromosomal. They're not formal, they're not material, but they begin to have indications about formal material geometric properties. They're sort of background intelligences for me. They're like our chromosomes. They're chromosomes. They're not what we look like. They're the relational properties. They're the sort of the background that allows us to become who we are. So I made a series of these, and I made a series of proto-formal drawings, which are prior to form. So they're not DNA. They're not chromosomal. They're trying to move closer to material and formal definition. This is a drawing for a big marble surface, which gets etched away by 9 drawing instruments that are related to the 9 Greek muses. And there's a crypt in which the marble dust falls into, and that crypt moves around the site when different constituencies or audiences are in the site. So it has an intelligence. It reads the density of populations, and that crypt moves amongst those populations, blah, 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 blah. So this is another, there are a bunch of drawings that belong to the project. This is a proto-formal section through the primary, let's say, architectural element. There's a harvesting surface. There's an archive with objects that never existed. The pink pieces are sort of gallery-like pieces. There's a theater for the muses, and so on. It's beginning to be geometric and material, but not quite there yet. I also let notes about hunches, things that I don't know how to get into the physical and material makeup, things which might be left over from another drawing. This is from the garden for the project, and so on. So there are naive things in these drawings. There are things that I'm more certain about. So I also let myself keep a whole range of things in play. I use language, speeds of attention, dioramic clouds, daedalus, farm animal beauty pageant, and so on. So the drawings are repositories, they're cauldrons, they're collections in these cases. And then a former student, we just modeled a very, very quick take on the museum. So it's a very, very, very first pass. It would take 300, 400, 500 hours to move this, to transform it to be a reasonable piece of work. I've been interested in erasure as an architectural or spatial activity, as well as a representational activity. So the picture plane, the development of the picture plane in the Renaissance allows the architects to add value to the work, to add figuration, to add materials. Fantastic. I got interested because of Duchamp and the urinal and opening conceptual frameworks for myself. I wondered if erasure could be a way to work on architecture. So I made some relational drawings that simply work on erasure or flattening out or bleaching out towards the production, which I never completed, of a house. So I was interested in essentially erasing the house, furniture, infrastructure, practices, program, erasing that stuff, and then recoding it and populating that emptied, or not emptied, it's not a minimalist approach, that evacuated content field with 2 what I call reflexive objects that would then nurture. This isn't a plan or a section or an elevation, it's just a relational drawing. But these objects, as I imagine them, would then nurture and rebloom essentially this now erased condition. Other pieces of work, I was interested. Jan Vermeer, Dutch painter, is a great influence on me. And this is a painting called The Art of Painting. And I was wondering if I could erase that painting, if I could eventually get to the art of architecture. Now, this is a 0.5% of what that work would need to entail to ask the question about whether I could use erasure with the art of painting to get to a new art of architecture. I didn't finish it. That's as far as I got. I mentioned that I like to work and think sometimes analogically, and I work with students sometimes when it's appropriate in analogical thinking. That is likenesses. So in 2004, I realized I was working hard but slowly. And I said, what if you developed a desert house by thinking analogically? So I made 3 key kind of site drawings based on certain analogical thinking, which I'll share with you in a moment. This is the second one. This is the third one. And always I got hundreds of yellow pads, so 50, 75 sheets in a pad. This project probably has 55 of these sheets. References, research, sort of formal things, notes about a film that I saw that might bear on the work that I'm doing, what I need to read 2 weeks from now to influence the work and so on. So I make a lot of these, or I used to. And then this is the first proposal. So I just started with ideas about ground, sky, and horizon. I said, you got to start simply. And I imagined that there were garden surfaces that were like empty game boards. And I imagined that there were pieces of architecture that were like streamlined trailers crossed with prehistoric animals. And I imagined that there were things like petticoats. And I imagined that there were things like blah, 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 blah. So as the proposal developed, I made a whole series of drawings. This is a composite drawing, which was partly an elevation, partly a section. For example, there are internal pieces to some of the architecture. This is an elevation that's being erased and parts are being removed and taken to the landscape. There are notational things in the drawing and so on. Just working on a suite of drawings to work on ground, sky, and horizon. And of course, I couldn't contain myself. And all of a sudden, I'm dealing with hybrid archetypes. I'm dealing with hidden languages. I'm dealing with problems of isolation in the desert and so on. Anyway, then subsequently, the same fellow that helped with the museum, we made a quick visualization of the desert house proposal. And I'll just name a few things. So it has a labyrinth of emptiness that you can't get into. It has a cast bronze biplane. It has a chromed billiard ball. This is where you eat inside of this. This is a part of the insides of this that comes out once in a while. You sleep in this piece. They're cuckoo clock-like vessels. This is a pink dust garden. This is the living space, and we'll look at that in a moment. Then there are chromed shadows. So there are chrome surfaces for these big objects. There, and there. And then there are real shadows from a desert, let's say. And then there are these garden surfaces that have cryptic languages of different kinds in each one of the garden surfaces and so on. There's a fence and faults and artificial and real cacti and so on. Anyway, these are again, quick studies. This would probably take 200 or 300 hours to really then move it to say, okay, this is starting to get somewhere. So you see things like the chrome shadows and shadows produced by the sun and the setup of the whole thing. So this is a piece. You live in these baskets, and this piece is filled with logs. This is made of steel, and it's calibrated to dematerialize over 100 years. So eventually you get a pile of logs. This for different reasons, so I'm not going into the ideas. But anyway, this piece moves back and forth across this pink dust garden when no one's there. You eat inside here. There's a small sort of reading space up here, artificial garden here. Here's the billiard ball, the fence, blah, 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 blah. These are the sleeping chambers that move up and down. And if this moves across the pink dust garden, storage space that, like a petticoat and so on. This is a stair that goes to nowhere. That starts as a real proper stair and goes to 3 inches at its top. Again, lots of reasons. There are lots of ideas around this stuff, which I'm not really sharing with you. So these are just views of the proposal. A lot of fun. 2004. This is the living space. We're looking down on it. These are the baskets you live in. This is one of them. You can't see the other. And there's a miniature version of the proposal that's built on the side of that living space. And there's a mechanical hawk that belongs to that. So there are other real hawks and so on. I'm very, very grateful both for the invitation to join all of you, but from now, many things, to be honest, around the world. And I got invited to the Prague Biennale of International Art in 2005, the year our daughter was born. And I was asked to deal with architecture as a transient phenomenon. So without going into detail, I made, with two former students, we made a 15-foot long object drawing thing that we shipped to Prague. These are just biopsies of the digital ground for it. And it tries to looks at animal behaviors, how they navigate space, how they hunt, how they procreate, there are extinct ones, there are cloned ones, there are unborn ones. So there are 5 different species of animal-like things. And then there are 3 programmatic elements that belong to the proposal and so on. So that's just a kind of strategic plot, a conceptualization. I got some research funding here at the school in 2009 and worked with a former thesis student. And we were interested in how we could take landscape elements, berms, fences, revetments, lakes, and so on, and crossbreed those with, I'm going to go back, crossbreed those with landscape types. So the meander garden, the picturesque, a formal garden, and so on, the knot garden, drawing characteristics from garden types, and then crossing those things with landscape biologies, that is, temporalities that belong to the landscape, meaning a drought or an insect infestation, things that are driving landscapes temporally. And we developed a whole series of drawings. For example, we were investigating here what we called fabric predators. So they're also invented programmatic thinkings to try to work on this crossbreed of these 3 different attributes of landscape towards a new architecture, a new landscape. We made a series of analogic drawings. We made a series of digital models. These are called zipper blooms. They're early studies. There are notational, real, and indexical landscapes as part of this discussion. And we modeled and worked in Photoshop. We made a series of final drawings. Really, I always say about 8% of where the work should have gotten. So there are test tube berms, and there are these notational and real landscapes and so on. So these are images, fabric predators of that final proposal. A good friend, Gretchen Wilkins, who now is the director at Cranbrook in the architecture program, invited me and 29 other architects to participate in a project which was concerned with documenting urbanism. That was the program that Gretchen gave us. And there was a book made, and we each had the book for 2 weeks. So I made these 2 pages and a project that I called Alchemic Urbanism that basically was interested in harvesting surpluses in cities. It's a smallish book. So these are the 2 pages enlarged a bit of my 2 pages. I then shipped it to someone, I forget where, I shipped mine to Pittsburgh, and that person shipped theirs to Singapore. So for 2 weeks, we produced a book essentially. When I work on things that I'm curious and interested in. In 2006-ish, I got interested in the photographs by National Geographic of the Titanic on the ocean floor. And I began to produce a series of drawings where I was trying to autopsy those images. The interest was, and this is as far as I got the work, I was interested in trying to then translate many of the aspects of the event, of the physicality, of the remnants of the ship on the ocean floor, on the social, political ramifications. I was interested in translating that into a large oceanic surface that would essentially, it would do a number of things. It would rehearse the histories and the physicality of the event, but it would also serve as a kind of orphanage for lost animals, nesting things for migrating, and it would talk to satellites. I didn't finish that. I don't finish a lot of work because I've got a lot of things. I work very, very, very little. I've worked about 10 months in the last 16 years here in total. So I've got a lot of open-ended things, and some are closed. Anyway, when SCI-Arc moved downtown, I was in SCI-Arc, all three of SCI-Arc's locations. And this, when we moved downtown, my dear friend Coy Howard and I, Coy's taught at the school probably 45 years now. Great teacher, great architect, very, very dear friend. We didn't know downtown LA. We know other LAs. If you've been there, there are a bunch of parts that comprise LA. Didn't know very well downtown. We said never I don't think I collaborated maybe once at this time. Anyway, we said, let's do a collaboration. So we framed 7 pieces of work. One was a big park above Broadway. One was a series of sonic monuments in the city. One was a series of facade remakes. And another one was speculative rooftop houses. So we designed 5 of them. They're hugely different. Each one has different kinds of ideas, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, 2 summers ago, we made these things in 2002 and 3. Tons of drawings, technical drawings, sketches, references, crushing paper, making models, blah, 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 blah. 2 years ago, I said, I'm going to make the plans of these things. So these are simply in process plans of those houses. I get interested in lots of things. So I've been interested in 2017 in building envelopes, surfaces. So I've got 6 teed up, and I'm showing you 2. So I'm interested in what building envelopes might be like. So it's cut paper, drawn parts, and essentially using parts of my David's Island project, using, me cutting paper out in particular ways and so on to try to imagine this vertical surface. There's another one, which the drawing table looks like this, which is interested in using medical imaging technologies, X-rays, MRIs, even 3D scanning as a way to begin to think about a vertical surface which trades on those kinds of technologies. So the whole thing is imagined to be the first pass at a vertical surface. I've been more interested recently in the picture plane and trying to dismantle the picture plane. And some years ago, I began to make what I called a floor triptych. I'm interested in triptychs for different reasons historically, but also in terms of their allegorical narrative functions and so on. Anyway, the interest in the project is really to make a floor and ceiling triptych. Therefore, to essentially dismantle the vertical plane, the picture plane, the station point. So these are just some cut paper pieces that belong to a larger drawing assembly. My dear friend Nat Shard, I always put in a pitch for Nat. We won Pamphlet Architecture 34 in 2012. And we were interested in contingent architecture. That is, architectures that don't predict what you do, but enable you to participate and again, to construct your own forms of participation. Anyway, a guy called Mark Stanley, who's also a dear friend, Mark designed Pamphlet for us, and this is the cover of Pamphlet Architecture 34. So Nat and I developed, we were working on a forensic laboratory for drawing. And part of my initial work was to make a series of drawings this work comprises 16 of the 18 pages, of the 80 pages, sorry, of the book. And it's printed super dark, and we didn't know that, and blah, blah, blah. So if anyone owns it, apologies. It wasn't meant to print that dark. Anyway, I made a series of drawings to try to get involved in this, in contingent and indeterminate architecture, but also to work on this laboratory for forensic drawing. And these are images of some of the drawings which I made. And then Nat_Chard, C-H-A-R-D, that's his Instagram site, Nat_Chard, has for years, amongst many other things, been making these drawing instruments. So we decided to make a pair of drawing instruments which would house my world and Nat's world. And essentially, these drawing instruments, he was living in Winnipeg at the time. I've never lived closer than 600 miles to Nat. He teaches at the Bartlett now. And anyway, these drawing instruments essentially throw paint at each other. So this is one of the paint, throwing paint at my world. And I do the same thing to him. And here's my setup. Here's my world, my drawing. This is a lot of content-based stuff here. This is my world. This is Nat's world. You can see some of the results of some of the paint throws. And each of our worlds has a drawing instrument. It has a dome with a kind of narrative construction, a set of stories which are told. It has an object which interrupts the paint flow and it has drawing. So that's Nat's world. This is a close-up of my world. This is a Mark put together a time-lapse composite of a paint throw from Nat towards my world. This is the thing that interrupts the paint throw. This is the thing that I use to throw paint at Nat. And then this is Nat's world. Again, to develop our friendship, most importantly, we share interests, but we don't work on them at all similarly. So that was an impetus for the work, questions about contingent architecture and so on. Subsequent to that, we were asked to give a 4-day workshop in Winnipeg at the ICA plugin gallery. We were also asked to lecture, and we were asked to exhibit in this room some of our work. So these are just images of, mostly to show you some of Nat's drawing instruments and some other things related to his work. These are drawing instrument related. These are body related things. Here's one of his drawing instruments. They're incredible. He's a super smart, interesting, dear friend. We're working on a project right now for an exhibition in September in Montreal, and a book that belongs to that exhibition, and so on. So this is some of my stuff, which I showed, and this is some of Nat's world here, and so on. And then I was the Sir Bannister Fletcher visiting professor at the Bartlett in 18 and 19. And Bob, I interacted with the school in a lot of ways, six trips over a week at a time. And anyway, one of the ways in which we interacted, or that I did in particular with Nat, is we were asked we populated the entire ground floor and we staged an exhibition of our work. Super grateful again to Bob, to the school. They built all the stuff for the exhibition, and these are images of that exhibition. There's some of Nat's body drawings, which are extraordinary, Polaroids and airbrushed, and here's some of our pamphlet work down here, and so on. I'm going to make a quick jump now. I was trained on a drawing table, basically, and making models. In 2018, I said, you got to make a run. I was working with all the students working Maya, Blender, Rhino, scripting, coding, and so on. And I understand those softwares conceptually and sometimes operationally, but I don't know how to do that work. So I said, let's sneak up on this. So in Photoshop, I began to make what I called speculative house, garden, and landscape proposals. And I imagined them as kind of drone views. And I basically I find things online, or I use my own drawings with things I find online. I'm literally just trying to figure out, how do you use cut and paste? What's the transform tool? How do you use the paintbrush? So I'm literally baby steps, but using the vehicle of house, garden, landscapes as a way for me to then practice those techniques, but also to enlarge my conceptual and formal and material range. So I'm not saying that I would directly make working or technical drawings from these, but if I imagine that these are each house, garden, landscape proposals, I'm thinking about landscapes and gardens and houses in pretty different ways, very, very, very quickly. The longest one of these is probably 2.5 hours, and I know nothing about Photoshop. So, I'm struggling to figure out how to get the paintbrush thing to work and what size it should be. And, anyway, I don't throw any away. There are about 150 of these. Super fun. They're kind of one-a-days, but, I do them at midnight when I was done with, teaching and writing and whatever else I was doing, lecturing. They're super, super, super fun. Again, they're all flat. They're just, in this case, I'm just using a pair of pieces of work of mine. One of the drawings from pamphlet 34 and Bird Motel, which I'll show you in a minute. And this is just using one of my drawings and so on. So these are, I have an interest in these. I think out of the 150, there are about 12 or 15 that I wouldn't mind developing. This is one of them. So this is using my drawing, one of my drawings essentially, and parts from race cars, Formula One cars, and then just, basically collage techniques. I don't often have, have big ideas. I just get involved saying that seems interesting to me. Well, there's a strange scalar fluctuation there. That could be a strange interior exterior fluctuation of a garden, landscape, house-like thing, and so on. This is just using my own work. Again, using my own work. The vertical surfaces, the first vertical surface is used again, and sort of plan-like, and so on. Just trying to invent, just trying to learn the techniques, to be honest. In Photoshop, a few of them, and then trying to, as a byproduct, increase things I mentioned, my imagination. I can imagine these as spatial realms. Not literally, they'd need work, but I can imagine these easily. These are super simple for me to imagine in the way my creative and my imaginative constitution are. And they look weird to everybody else. You say, what are you talking about? This is a top view of a garden landscape house. What are you talking about? And for me, yeah, they need work. And they might reformat how we live, how we think programmatically, and so on. But they're easy for me to imagine. So yeah, I can imagine this as spatial. And so in that regard, my good friend, teacher, architect, Jeff Halstead saw some of these, and he said, he's a digital guru. He said, let's do a collaboration. Let's see what would happen if we work quickly on a couple of these to see what would happen just formally, no other ideas, formally, materially. So this is my drawing. And this has worked in ZBrush quickly, talking with Jeff, him, the operations, he feeding back ideas and so on. So this is me using, again, vertical surface drawing and bird hotel things and so on. And then this is using ZBrush. These are some of the quick translations formally and maybe materially of that house, garden, landscape realm. And then one last one. This is the drawing, the original drawing. And then this is actually two houses in one. So the black, white, and blue is another house, and the sort of yellow, green, limey one is another one. So there are two houses, because I said, this is ridiculous. This is just villa after villa. What happens when two or three of these get involved? So that started to be of interest to me, how we could begin to mix, two or three drawings and begin to think about two or three house, garden, landscape things simultaneously existing. Similar kind of work, I got interested in what I call new objects or new objectives. And these are, I don't know what they are. There may be object-like, they might be architecture-like, but they're essentially the same thing as the speculative house garden landscape drawings. Basically, I'm just finding stuff, and then I'm working with those things to produce whatever these might become. And what happened is I got super interested in my misuse, the paintbrush, for example, how I use that. I got interested in that as a form of generating work. So my misuse of things like the way I cut and paste, or the way that I scale things, the way I cut something out, the way I use the paintbrush tool, I got super interested in that. And I'm now working on this piece with that, which learns from this body of work. I'll now move through a handful of bird motels. So in 2015, I got invited in Italy for work with 29 other architects to design a birdhouse. They were going to auction the birdhouse. They're physical. They were going to auction them for a nonprofit to help support the efforts of the organization. So with 3 former students, this is very, very, very quick work. We made what we call inspirational drawings. We made 13 proposals in Photoshop to start. We selected one of them and then made a series of inspirational drawings for that one, of which these are some of those images. Work on it. There are a bunch of ideas in play. I won't talk about that as much as the collaboration with those 3 characters and those inspirational drawings, then leading to this bird motel, which is about the size of a large dinner plate, to give you a sense of it. There's a bird landing strip. There's a spiritual bird. There are feathers and bird nests that get hung from this. There are artificial clouds. There's a windsock room. There's surveillance equipment. This is the spiritual bird from below with its feathered realm and a nest. It holds all kinds of things. So this is just a straight top view. It's called the Flights of Fancy Bird Motel, and the name of it's here. It has artificial hedges. It has bird perches and so on. The first title image I showed was this collaboration with Mark West. So we imagined this bird motel not to be a white thing like that, but as an evolving, emergent, temporally activated realm. So Mark saw the work and he said, let's go to work on this using my drawings and his techniques, some photographs that he's made and so on, to imagine this thing evolving as an ecology of things over and through time. So this is the bird motel seen in an evolutionary sequence, let's say. It would take a lot of work to really work on this, but these are just quick visualizations to imagine that. The second bird motel then learned from the first one, and it's called El Dorado, and it was worked on again with a former student. And the bird motels are interested in human, non-human relationships. They're interested in inverting kind of programmatic logics for humans and making them possible for birds, and all kinds of programmatic interests and realms for birds. And they exist in real and fictional landscapes. There are sometimes many of them. There are different versions of them. In this case, there are things like dancing bird alphabet topiary gardens. So this topiary garden made of flowers, it actually dances, moves across surfaces, and inscribes information on a dome below, which is above a bird ballroom, which the bird ballroom has dioramic wallpaper, which projects distant landscapes into it. There is a dead tech garden, which is for the birds, which is comprised of all kinds of aerial components. There's a fountain for them, a Dymaxion, Bucky Fuller Dymaxion map as a rug. And then we made a series of final visualizations to use not only the technical attributes, the bird feeding table, the landing strip, the wind the wind surface, an homage to Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, the Stuffed Technology Garden. Anyway, those are the things that belong to this. And there's a hull with, let's see, the hull has rooms, and the ballroom is in here, and it has a retractable circus and so on. Anyway, we use the visualizations to tell stories. So it's not just a technical description, but we were trying to fuse birds with clouds, with atmospheres, and trying to produce miniature environments, working representationally, trying to set multiple frames, a kind of composite drawing to build up the world of these bird motels. So trying to use generatively the images, not just the design, to work on things. Then there's a third bird motel, which is an homage to Wallace Stevens, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And that's a poem which in each stanza, Stevens writes about blackbirds in super indirect ways. So it's the glint of an eye and the shadow and the rustle in a forest. So the blackbird is only pointed to, it's never described. So that's, for me, in terms of heterogeneous thinking, it's a sort of useful curiosity cabinet. Anyway, this one is called Skywriter, and it essentially writes, it prints Wallace Stevens' poems in the sky. And I'm just going to show you a series of, they're not complete, but I'm going to show you a series of iterations of this bird motel. So we start this way, and we eventually work through then to these kinds of things that are digitally modeled and talking to certain drawings that I was making. And again, digital models, just to show you, so I don't know if it's transformation. This is a kind of developmental trajectory. I'm not sure that it's a transformational trajectory. Anyway, a whole series of things which are made quickly. I pay everybody a bit when they work with me. I don't have a lot of money at all, so it comes from seed funding from the school. Anyway, Carl was working with me on this, collaborating. And when I collaborate with people, they bring ideas to the table. They're super, I've worked with them generally as students. They're super smart, skilled, interesting, invested. So they bring stuff to the table as well. I set the agenda and say, these are things that interest me. This is what I think the work is about. And then they say, yeah, that seems interesting to me, but let's think about these couple of things as well. So that's the way it works. They don't work for me. I work with them, and we have fun. So these are some of the images that were produced for this bird motel, and then we made some final images, which is there are several versions of this one, as there are with the second one. There are lots of versions. There are things like a talisman. There's a theater and spa inside of this. This is part of the theater. There's a zoetropic restaurant that roams around with these characters. There's housing. So these are just composite drawings where we're trying to tell the story. This is the housing for the birds. There's a working log. And there are lots of ideas, and I'm not going into those so much. Here's the working log. This is the artificial weather garden. First pass. This is the first kind of complete pass of the project. So it would need a tremendous amount of work to get it saying, okay, this is working, and the kind of ideas, the representational structures working, and so on. So these are some of the images that we produced. This is an homage to Lauget's primitive hut. It's a diving board it's a mechanical diving board for the birds, and so on. The same guy, Carl, we're now working on what we call Tugboat, which is a fourth bird motel. I'm going to try to make 13 of these, 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, 13 bird motels. Some will be realish, like these. Some will be discursive. Others will be rhetorical. Those will become, I hope, part of an organizational structure for a book if I ever get there. Anyway, we're just starting this one. So this is an inspirational image for Tugboat, and just starting to model some things right now. Nat Chart and I were working on a site called Orford Ness, which is a military ballistics testing site, World War II in England on the coast. And my first foray into the work was what I called aerial diptych follies. So I made a series of drawings, of which these are 3, and they're two-part follies. These are follies. These are things that don't appear to do anything. Follies don't do anything. They don't have an apparent function. So these have at the top, let's see, where'd my cursor go? Whoops. See if I can find my cursor. These are analogical drawings. So at the top, there's a kind of a spectacle part. And at the bottom, there's a kind of the second half. The bottom half is a kind of surveillance condition, blah, blah, blah. So these are cut paper, a little bit of Photoshop work after the fact and so on, just to get the work going. And this is, me working on the table with cut paper. There's no, I copy, download things, copy them, cut them out with an X-Acto blade, buy paper online or at stores, make my own paper and so on, as a way to work on this particular kind of drawing. Anyway, I got interested in these as images. So we scanned them and then made them in, this is an image. And I made a proposal to the school for a small amount of seed funding, again, to think about relationships between an image and digital modeling as related to that image. So worked with another former student, Oliver, and we, in Blender, we began to explore relationships between images and modeling. For example, do images have backsides? What about RGB in relationship to CMYK image modeling protocols? What about file sizes? What about modeling flat notations? So we were interested in this entire workspace. This was the site. The drawings were just a foil, a vehicle, a serviceable mechanism for us to ask a series of questions about image modeling relationships and potential there. So each of these 3, every single thing in these is modeled in Blender. Every single thing is modeled. Each one of the 3 aerial diptych follies has its own objectives. So this one is meant to be a kind of theatrical stage set-like realm. And for example, we got interested in wireframe information in relationship to rendering information. What's the potential in the discussion about wireframes being hidden essentially inside of what appears to be a pictorial structure and so on. So these are the kinds of questions that we were working on in this work. So this is the first one, super fun, 2018, summer, quick, same time as Skywriter Bird Motel. So we were, there were overlaps with Oliver and Carl and me in the work, and it was a super fun body of work. So these are images from the first one. Then the second one, this is me. And then its objectives were to explore, again, image modeling questions, but also the drawing was meant to then generate an outside world. So that's the program for this drawing relative to the image digital modeling discussion. And you see, us modeling notations and calibration marks. And you see Carl's work, one of the bird motels, looped into this. And, similar kinds of questions, just looking for potential. How do you model notations? Can you model light sources? What about modeling, or what's the information status or data status of shadows? Does that have shadow projections? Does that have potential? So these are some of the final images. Again, everything's modeled. Everything is modeled and rendered in Blender. And then the last one, we were interested, again, we're interested in everything. What's the potential of that diagram? What about this Cartesian grid? What about this? Camera angles. What are there potentials in this discussion of images to digital models? I'm almost finished, so apologies for taking longer than you might have patience for. So thanks for coming and thanks for hanging with me. Anyway, I'm just going to try to follow. So this is a rendering of a translation of my drawing. And I always like to point to this. This is a piece of cut paper in the drawing. And if we watch this, in particular, so we're modeling notations and calibration marks and so on to see what the potential might be, modeling clouds and blah, blah, blah. So the cut paper surfaces here. But as we develop it, we wondered if that backside of that cut paper, if there were backsides to images, and in fact, what would they be? So this is the backside of that cut paper image as we imagined it. That's a view of it. This is the front side of that paper. So again, just a bunch of questions about imaging and digital modeling. And these are some of the kind of questions that we're working on. So this one was interested also in the kinds of instruments and devices that worked on the image modeling translation. And the frog's one of them. And these are called skitterers and so on. Skitterer here. So these are some of the final images that we produced for that work. Work in progress. Very quickly, I'll finish up quickly here. I'm working now on a series of drawings that I call 2080. And essentially, I'm trying to get 20% of the effort rather than me stuffing stuff full of all kinds of stuff. Could 20% of the spatial and representational effort do 80% of the work? So I've made a series of drawings now, and these are just, this is what it looks like in progress, cut paper, paint chips, me drawing stuff, cutting things out and marking those markings and erasing stuff and blah, blah, blah. Introducing some of our, when Ella was a little girl, 17 now, our daughter, these Japanese erasers, and introducing an entourage to see whether that could inspire the work. Anyway, these are photographs of the final drawings, and just getting ready to step into the next. These are preparatory drawings. They're just getting ready to what would this become? And then another piece of work which is simultaneously just barely underway. We're starting to just work on this. It's called Google Earth Deep Horizon, and the initial interest had to do with how landscapes talk to Google Earth and satellites. And if Google Earth is a way that we experience many parts of the world, like I use Google Earth all the time just to work out, well, what do the shrines at Ise look like, from above? So I use Google Earth, blah, blah, blah. So that work was initiated from an interest in imaging from above as a social and political construction, as well as an optical construction. And it's now evolved into a series of interests to do with agricultural practices and orphaned animals and damaged animals and references to scripted languages. So there's an idea now about 6.5 large arcs that move through the Midwest, inscribing languages, housing damaged animals, and so on. So just getting started with that. And then one final piece of work called Triptychs, Domes, and Still Lifes. And the initial interest and a bit of funding, again, from the school, very, very grateful for the money. And Kyle working on the 6.5 arcs Google Earth problem. But I was interested in how we use precedents in this work. So I identified a number of precedents from certain abandoned lost cities to the shrines at Ise, to Borromini's San Carlo in Rome, to Misa's Barcelona pavilion, to Chinese scroll paintings, to triptychs, and so on. The Noli map of Rome, could we rethink the use of those precedents? So there are 3 primary strategies within that larger organization of interest. This is called niche, and it's essentially a stage setting. These are early images. And then there's a ton of work. Everything's modeled. There's a ton of work in this work. So for example, Borromini's church was digitally modeled. We then flattened the church and reconstructed it with angels reconstructed. There's a house for angels, and there's this total. You take the precedent, you model it, you flatten it digitally, then you reconstruct it. I'm just showing you one part of this, and it's the most elaborate part of this particular strategy. Yeah. So these are some of the final images that we're trying to work on. It's strategy number 1 within 3 strategies of triptychs, domes, and still lifes. And these are some of the images that we're trying to finish up now to just close the project. There's a ton of work to do, but there are other things to do. Same precedents. We wondered if we could, as a second strategy, just organize them. Knowing, just organize them. And there's some new things introduced. There are some animals and some sort of gardening equipment introduced, but basically all the elements are still here, as in the first proposal. So again, it's just each proposal also then within those precedents, it both uses the precedents, but also generates its own kinds of ideas and interests. So for example, this is a table it's called the Borromini table. And there's a mosque which gets reconstructed and tagged, and there's one of the shrines at Issei, and there are Chinese scroll paintings that get elaborated upon, and so on. So this is a small piece of the work, and these are some of the early studies of the tagging of one of the shrines at Issei, the great shrines at Issei in Japan. And this is the mosque that gets reconstructed, and this is the table, and so on. So we're just trying to figure out these are just views of other Baroque churches and Borromini domes and so on. These are not screenshots, they're renderings, but they're not final images. This is maybe one of the final images. And we're doing a series of studies right now to look at another series of images that belong to that, to finishing that thing. And then there's one last proposal, and it's what I'll finish with. It's the reconstruction of the great Zen garden at Ryoanji in Kyoto. Same elements again, Chinese scroll paintings. See if I can find them here. Yeah, you start to see some of the pieces. Anyway, there are roughly 6 strategies within this single strategy. So this first one that I'm showing you is essentially a kind of total reconstruction of the garden. And these are images of that reconstruction. And this is the total garden reconstructed using the same elements, modeling skies, using pieces of other projects, and Japanese influences are also here. But, you start to see the other bits. And then there's a strategy which basically looks at Hollywood backlots for shooting films and thinks of things as mobile, the parts of this garden as mobile. So this is the top view of the garden, sort of as it exists. And then there are a series of things that we do to this stage setup, like erasing certain kinds of things and cloaking and veiling things as a way to study the precedents, but also as a way to reconstruct the garden. Then there's a series that are called critical fragments, where we're just picking up certain key elements and beginning to try to understand the garden through those critical fragments. Again, digitally modeled. And there's another strategy in which we're looking at nighttime things, and at 3 different modeling techniques. So there are wireframes, there are full-on render model bits, and then we're modeling things like Illustrator in this one. Whoops. Don't know what happened there. Anyway, some views of that strategy. And then there's a construction site strategy, which is this one. And we take one of my bleached out drawings and model that, and then set up those precedents as a construction site. And these are some of the working views of that proposal. The garden reconstruction using the stuff, still using the stuff, as a way to re-examine both the precedents, but also to rethink this garden. So these are some of the another strategy, which is another kind of nocturnal strategy, which is a kind of collagic technique, which uses modeled parts and reassembles those fragments. And then one last strategy, which has to do with then taking the images from the construction site strategy and working on those images as images. So these are renderings, for example, of the construction site strategy. And then, whoops, that doesn't want to advance. Let's see if I can go back. The connection's lost. Now I'm connected. Okay. Anyway, then, so we're taking the construction site strategy of the Rio Angie proposal, and now we're trying to work on the images, not the strategy, the images of renderings of the strategy to see if we can open up other understandings about the precedents and about the garden itself. So there's just a couple of finishing images, and then I'm finished. These are being worked on. These are being worked on now, and that's it. So thank you all. Thanks to the school. Thanks to Elias, Chris, Joseph. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you for with it. Like, is it still? I don't know. Is it like Saturday there now? Something like that. Anyway, thank you all for your patience and for the drive-by shooting here. Not that's politically incorrect, but a quick look at a cross-section of some things that I've worked on.
It was an amazing lecture. Thanks.
Total pleasure. My pleasure. If anybody's alive out there and you're, I don't know, it's like midnight there and your stomachs are growling and you're tired of listening and looking at stuff. If anybody has questions or observations or help, giving me help, that would be that's probably the desired thing, to help me.
I'm going to start with my own question.
Okay.
Okay, so in this virtual and digital era we're going through, with visual art being sold as NFTs, do you think can you hear me?
I can. I'm just chuckling because NFTs, number of people have. Anyway, go on, Joseph.
Do you think your work can benefit from these new platforms and use them to support it?
So I was chuckling because a number of people have contacted me or asking me about NFTs in my work. I've not done that. I think increasingly, I think the modes of distribution and dissemination, forms of readership and audiences, and so on are being completely changed. We know in the last 15, 20 years, according to social media constructs. No, people don't go to by and large, they don't go to the library and check out a stack of books like I did when I was a graduate student at Columbia. They don't do that. So yes, to answer the question directly, but not my work, Joseph, but I think problems of curation, dissemination, authorship, readership, legibility, new forms of digitality, new forms of social construction and audience relationships. Yes, I absolutely think that we need to be thinking aggressively, not NFTs specifically, but Instagram, other platforms of dissemination or distribution. I think those need to become integrated in our teaching protocols and our practices as architects and as cultural agents, which I would beg the students, please think of yourself as cultural agents, not professional architects only. But yes, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Now, to overcome just more stuff, I think this is a question that concerns me. Like, I'm just putting more stuff on my Instagram site. We don't need more stuff. We don't need more of my stuff. So are there mechanisms or algorithms for combinations of things, or how to curate so that it's not just so overwhelming that we have no way to ground or take up or understand or participate with things like NFTs and Instagram sites and Facebook feeds and Twitter and so forth? I worry, how do you know what to look at? Students, how do you know what you ought to look at? When I was in school, postmodernism was just coming on. There was a very specific framework of things that we looked at. Everybody in all schools looked at those things. Now, who knows, man? Who knows? You know, clips from video games that are being hybridized by data sets of hijackers that are trying to promote da 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 da. You're looking at that, and then you're looking at film clips that are crossed into architecture. So that whole problem of curation, dissemination, does it matter what's important? Is there anything like good or qualitative distinctions, blah, blah, blah? Yeah. So yes, but to answer the question, absolutely, Joseph, absolutely.
Okay, great, thanks. We have two enormous questions from Samir Aid in the chat. Or three?
From Samir.
Yeah, three huge
Right.
questions.
I've never met him in person, but I didn't expect less.
So maybe we
I'm
can go through
teasing
them.
him, of course.
first.
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, Joseph.
He quote, quite an impressive visualizer and inspiring content. Thank you, Professor Kulper. Questions number one. And the relational fabrics of those cartographical drawings, both figurative and abstract clearly, tend to symbiotically merge in a way or another, in some kind of surrealistic cadaver exquisite manner. What would be, in your own speculation, the most beneficial contributor to the spatial reading of a deep map? The first degree quasi-obvious protagonist, a literal figure of a scaled bird, for example, or the open formal abstraction. Consequently, what would be your protocol when it comes to probing evidentiary fields while mastering the dosage and calibration of such densities, whether those are of analog or synthetic repertoires, graphical or formal indices, physical or digital sceneries, programmatic or spatial protovisions?
So, Samra, thank you very much. If I ever did a book, I think he needs to be the one. He needs to be the one doing the work and the book. Secondly, he should be lecturing about the work and not me. Thirdly, those are very, very complex questions. I think one has to do with legibility, who reads what, and how do they enter into the equations of these of mixed worlds, cartographic, figurative references, notations, and so on. I think that's the nature of the first part of the question, Summer. So many of the drawings, the Mylar drawings in particular, are never meant to be seen in public. They're worksheets for me. They're visual thinking. So the kind of questions I get now, because I've been fortunate to have quite a few exhibitions and published work and so on, who has keys to the door? Who owns keys, or do they need keys? I think that's part of the question. And so I'm in a quandary. I'm in a pickle where I generate the work as I need to. That doesn't mean Amy would come down to the basement where I was working, and she'd know what I was working on. She'd look at it and she'd say, I have no idea really how to translate what the drawing's about. So the hope is that there are enough pieces of fragmentary evidence that my mother, for example, might recognize a bird in a grid and begin to affiliate that or associate that or reference that to, a map that she had seen when we drove across the country, or that there are enough combinatory things in there that someone might say, that reminds me of a fairy tale that I once heard, or that inspires me to think about Galileo and Copernicus in different ways, because they're constellation-like things and latitude and longitude-like things and the same planetary. So the hope is that there are literal and explicit forms of engagement and literacy to people. There are then implicit things where people can say, that reminds me of this, this, and this, and there are other things that are totally invisible and only belong to me that no one, not even myself, could make sense of. I don't know whether I've caught the nature of the first part of that question or not. I think it has to do with the algorithms, the alchemic formations. Let's call them in the cosmologies. Let's say, what sense do we make of them, and who what do you do if you make sense of something or don't make sense of something? What do you do with that? Are you expected to project that? Are you expected to hold that in perpetuity? So what do you do with that if you can make sense of the kind of cosmologies or the thickened worlds? Maybe I've half addressed what I thought the first part of the question was. The second part of the question, can you just sort of maybe summarize or restate? I forget if there are 2 or 3 parts now, but
you can open the chat box. It's
okay. Not chat. I see it. Okay.
it should be on the lower right.
Yep. Yeah, and everybody can disappear because they're tired of listening to Perry.
Maybe they're tired of summer.
I doubt it. I'm only seeing a tiny. I've got to scroll through this to read the questions. I'm only seeing a tiny.
I think they have class also. So
Yeah. So please, thank you for coming, everyone. Don't feel obliged to stay. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to come and visit you someday. Yeah, the exquisite corpse is part of that. That's the surrealist stuff that, yes, that's part of the discussion sometimes, Summer, in the metaphorical engine as a part of structuring drawings, deep maps, obvious protagonist, yeah, scaled bird, formal abstraction, densities. Well, let me get this part of the question. Is Summer there? Where is he? Where are you, man?
Abdallah.
Here.
Samir is not with us. He's
okay. So okay, he
probably at home.
He knew better. He sat near the exit. What's your attitude concerning abusively accelerational use of imaging in current times? I'm one of your followers. Thank you for that. And I know for sure that you're wanting to post quantities of images per day. How could you refrain any banalization mechanism while reframing? Is this act of immediacy, the role of latitude? It's a little bit what we were talking about earlier in terms of curation, the proliferation of images, what you do with them. I worry about this a little bit, to be honest. I think if I get the nature of the second question, I don't worry about it. I'm a kind of a deep reader I try to be a deep reader of things. So when I see an image or I see a project, I'm trying to work out what's being structured, what the consequences are, significance culturally, and so on. I'm also getting acclimated to drive-by shootings, so sort of image after image after image after image as a form of structuring relationships. So we were asking, I think, fundamentally, what at the level of appropriating things, do I have an opinion about whether that's useful or interesting or good, or how that affects intellectual, disciplinary, visual thinking? I think that's the nature of the question. I think we have new forms of visuality now. So I think, I often think about Norman Bryson talking about the difference between the gaze and the glance. That is the deep read and the glance, the kind of the momentary catch, second aesthetic photography, just catch something. So I do think there are new formal, material, experiential things coming out of rotating through images quickly, assimilating an aesthetic for one of them, or a kind of technique influence. I think we need to be, those are parts of spatial, experiential, intellectual content, property, philosophical thinking. So I don't know whether I'm catching the answer or not. Sorry, and he can't say, yeah, you are, or no, you're not. So I'm off the hook. The digestion, I think we need to be educating about this. I don't think it's thing that we know enough about digitality now. We know enough about AI and machine learning. We know about data sets. We know about different forms of information, liminal bodies, extended bodies, and so on. I think this is content as much as let's design a library, or let's figure out how you draw a plan. Am I worried about it? I'm not worried. I think about things in terms of open potential, not a free for all, but things have potential. And I think we ought to get in bed. We really ought to try to cultivate fundamentally, I think, the relational setups that you're discussing. Do you want me to take a pass at the third one, or does someone else have a question?
You can do whatever you want. You can pass.
He asked about error a little bit. Collection of cosmic errors. What's the impetus of error in relationship to drawing? I'll try to answer that quickly. I don't think about things as errors. I think about them again as trajectories which might open something up. So I don't tend to find, I try to cultivate, harvest potential, and then I try to work out, I don't harvest everything like errors or erasures or mistakes, if that's the nature of the question. I look at the potential of those kinds of things, errors, let's say, and then I try to work out, might they or should they have a seat at the table, the other tables that I'm trying to organize in a piece of work. And I sometimes say, no, it's not interesting. It's not relevant. It's not pertinent to what I'm doing. Other times that might become a kind of content orientation, errors, miscues, falsities, and so on. So I have varied relationships to things like errors with respect to the roles and capacities they might have in a piece of work. Someone else have a question? I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's someone from the audience.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm sure I totally butchered the questions.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. My question is quite straightforward.
Excellent.
Less complicated. So I had a question regarding the range of medium you use. How is it that you choose the medium that you're going to use for a specific drawing?
That's a super nice question. Your name is, if I might ask?
Noor.
Ah. Do I follow you, Noor? I think I do.
Yes,
I think I do. Okay. Yes, that's the answer to the question. I got it. So it's a straightforward question. It's a slightly complex answer. I have a very, very small workspace and I have limited resources. So part of it has to do with things that are at hand. The second part of it has to do with trying to find appropriate means to work on something in particular kinds of speeds to keep certain relational properties or transformations that I'm interested in. So there's a kind of fitness then to what I'm working on relative to what's at hand, and I try to navigate those waters. Thirdly, I often don't have the things I need to work. For example, I'm interested in working on three-dimensional constructs now, physical things that have filmic parts and they have drawn parts that move and change phase states and so on. Many things I cannot work on with the mediums that I have, and I don't digital model and I don't script and code and so on. So I also look for the mediums to feed back to me. I can't work on things that are appropriate necessarily. So I say, well, I'm working with these things. What do they give me? So when I set up the tools on my table, a lead pointer, a scale, Copenhagen shifts curves, I look to those things, trace paper, Mylar, cut paper. I say, well, what are there potentials in those things to contribute to the construction of the larger project? So again, there are a number of levels that I try to consider when I make decisions about the mediums that I work with. And I also try to trace their histories. So if I'm scrubbing things with charcoal or using acrylic paint, I want to know a little bit about the etymology of acrylic paint. Why is it used? Where does it come from? And so on. So I try to also build a background, a copy machine. Where does it come from? How does it work mechanically? So I understand not just the thing as a thing, but also understand part of its relational distribution, let's say, if that makes sense. And those also, when I work in a good way, which is never anymore, because I'm doing a lot of other things. The way I work, either digitally or manually or both, and in my head, it's an enormously complex realm. I remember seeing a Wim Wenders clip that now affects the metaphorical structuring of this, but those construction lines need to be darker because they're affiliating themselves with those things. So when I work, That's the sort of mindset when I'm working generally. So your question is also a good one, because I'm working knowingly and unknowingly about choices like what you're suggesting, just making material choices. There's sometimes a lot of other stuff going on. And I say, those paint chips will work right now. They're not targeted, but they'll work relative to what I'm up to. And then I try to figure out, well, how to get them, things that seem naive as choices, how to get them so they seem inevitable. So I'm willing to take, leave parts of drawings in the drawing, cutting pieces of tape and putting those on the edge of the drawing and say, is that something? Yeah, so I don't mind being naive. Yeah, it's hard to do in school. The tutor comes up and says, what are you doing? You need to explain this to me. You can't say, I don't know, I was just cutting stuff out and it just landed, the windstorm came in the room and it just landed this way and it seemed interesting to me. That's hard. So I also think we need to, I try to be quite elastic as a teacher in terms of medium choices. I don't know, I just like the stuff. Okay, let's get that involved relationally and then try to knit it so that it's not just, okay, I just like it, which is also okay.
I have another question in correlation to that. Would you say that you always try to find a meaning to your drawings, or sometimes perhaps let the aesthetic part take over? Because there's this idea in some architects' head that you cannot purely have an architecture representation that is purely aesthetics.
You're asking a beautiful and I think a super important question. I've got lots of latitude. Yes, I think it can just be an aesthetic thing. When I make drawings, they're for different reasons. Some are to do with discovery, some are to do with aesthetic properties, some are to do with my own skill sets. So yes, no. Do I think everything needs to have meaning or significance or content? Absolutely not. If that's meant to go into the public realm, I think we want to reflect on then those things which were, okay, I just had some gold paint and I decided to spill it on the drawing. But if you take, for example, if you ask all artists historically to legitimize their work, particularly in the 20th century, there's no way that some of the abstract expressionists, for example, they're not working. Abstraction is not primarily working on content or meaning or significance, for example. Architects worry, and I do, because I'm interested in work being culturally durable. Multiple audiences, lifespans. But it doesn't mean that in work we can't have things that are just willful. I have things in that first desert house. There are parts of that architecture. There are 6 steel objects that make no sense to anyone but me. And they're not to do with the content. I just thought, that'd be interesting. There are 6 steel pieces meant to be built there, and they're not meant to be meaningful. In fact, they're meant to be ambiguous and to stimulate a curiosity about, is this stuff meaningful? Am I meant to participate in meaningful ways, or can I just be in? So I got a lot of room in terms of what you said. We wouldn't have art. We wouldn't have art if it all had to be content, meaning, significant, and so we would not have that. That's the role of critics and theorists and so forth, often to read, disseminate, to feedback. This is what the work's about. So, but again, that's hard in schools of architecture. In a methodology like gestural translation, I might throw red paint at the wall, pin 3 pheasant feathers to it, and say, I'm going to make an office building out of that. Now, that might not have to do with labor practices and social constructs and agreements within certain office formats and, techniques of material distribution and, codes and so on. It's a legitimate way to work. And it's a legitimate way to offer potential communicative, what I talk about is communicative potential. I don't talk about meaning. I virtually never use the word meaning, because it's so fraught. Your question is absolutely spot on. It is so fraught with expectations and philosophical, political, social baggage. I look for communicative potential as a much more generous term for me, and different degrees of graspability to different kinds of audiences. And I try to manage in the mechanics of engagement, those kinds of things, but I'm less meaning as a, for exactly the reasons, Nora, that you suggested. It comes loaded. I mean, it is a heavy arsenal of stuff, meaning, content. So, sorry for the long answer, but it's a very, very beautiful. You need to continue to ask that question: significance, communication, who participates, because there's a lot of stuff. Authorship, who participates, what is it, how does it participate with the history of things, and so on. There's a lot embedded. There's an iceberg embedded in that question that you asked. Dissertation, PhD, teaching, grant, foundation stuff, foundation money stuff. Chris, you're going to ask a question, or you're going to embarrass me, or someone else is.
We just wanted to say thank you very much.
Yeah. You're very, very welcome. Thank you for you. I mean, you're hearty souls there. This is like 7 hours listening to Perry go on and on about, whatever. So thank you all very much. I'm super happy to get to know you all increasingly over the last year. I have Instagram now with Chris, Joseph, Elias. I'm following certain people. I'll know more about the school, and I'm going to come and visit you. I would like to do that. I would like to do that.
Love it. Thank you so
Thanks.
much. Again.
You're
It
welcome,
was
Chris.
amazing.
Thank you very much. You're too generous. Thank you. Honored, grateful. Thanks for hanging around with me for a bit.
Thank you so much.
You're
And
very welcome. We'll be in touch.
yes, of course. And hope to see
Okay.
you soon at Alba in a few years.
And here's a reciprocation. I got to figure out what you're all doing at the school, and you need to share with me. You need to say, here's the proper website to look at stuff and so on. I need to know what's going on there.
Sure,
I'm
we'll
curious.
send you all kinds of info
Okay.
and projects and everything.
Okay, I can't. Yeah, I'll look at it, but I can't. I'm not. Yeah, got a lot of stuff that I can't say. Well, I'm going to give you thoughts about this. So anyway, thank you all very much. Super, super, super great to meet all of you.
Thank you.
You too. You too. Yeah. Okay. Have a great, I don't know, midnight run or something.
Evening.
Right now. Evening. Yes. Please go feed your growling stomachs. Okay. We'll talk soon. Yeah.
Sure,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. You're very welcome. My pleasure.